Okay, so welcome everybody back to our event series. We just posted all of our fall events online at the link below, desegregatect.org/events. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Bronin. I'm very happy to welcome you today, and I'll be moderating our panel. The event today is co-sponsored by Save the Sound, one of our coalition members, and we will have a presenter from Save the Sound as well. Before we begin, I thought we would just start with the brief introduction that we do in most of our outside events. First is to say who we are. We are a coalition of neighbors and nonprofits, and we believe that land use laws have had negative effects and that we do need some change. We did make some progress last year thanks to our coalition of nearly 80 nonprofit members, and many of you are members of these organizations that have come together for land use reform in Connecticut, both at the state and local levels. We accept as a coalition that land use laws need to be changed, but if you're not ready for that yet, I encourage you to visit our website and click on at the very top of the page the link that says Why Act. And that'll bring you to this page that's full of information about why we think that change is needed. One of those elements on that page is the economic case for zoning reform. That is a brief that we just updated, and we will be updating, or we will be producing briefs for the equity case and the environmental case that's very similar to this one. So stay tuned for that, but this one is updated and up online. I also wanted to point you to a new page on our website, which is called Be the Change, and it includes multiple playbooks for land use candidates, commissioners, and advocates. Each of these are tailored to the audience. They are up, if you just again go to the top right and click on Be the Change, that as well as a slew of other things that you can do in any of your roles to help to encourage our state to move forward. So there's plenty of links on that page. Catherine Blanco, who's on this call, is fielding the organizing at desegregatect.org email address. We're working on a couple of fronts right now. In your communities, you may have seen discussions about accessory apartments. This session, we will be moving forward with advocacy around zoning around train stations. So I encourage you to check out all of that. Check out the webpage in the website, and you'll see we have a new one-pagers about both of those things, and we encourage you to check those out and share them. Okay, so with that, I am going to start the discussion and turn it over to our panelists, but let me briefly introduce all three of them. We are so excited to have all three of these panelists to introduce our topic, which will really be the theme throughout the fall, that land use policy is climate policy, and that zoning laws and planning documents really have a huge impact on our environment, because zoning, for one thing, dictates everything that gets built within our state, and really shapes the way that we live and how much we drive, whether we can walk, and whether we are destroying farmland and forest as we grow. So with that very brief introduction, I want to introduce, I'll talk about each of them, and then I'll turn it over to Matthew first. I will introduce Matthew first. He is with California YIMBY, a nonprofit organization with 80,000 members, which is amazing. We hope to get to that point at some point. And 22 local teams that in 3 years has helped to advance statewide legislative reform in California. Matthew is the communications director of California YIMBY, and he will first be introducing a short video, which I think I'll be playing, and then provide some remarks about why California YIMBY has focused on the nexus between housing and climate. Next, we will have David Anderson. So swapping the order here in the photos. Dave is the land campaigns manager of Save the Sound, the co-sponsor of this event. It, as an organization, aims to improve land, air, and water of Connecticut and Long Island Sound through legal action, legislative advocacy, science, and community engagement. David will identify a few ways that our current land use regime has negative environmental impacts, turning from California back to Connecticut. And then finally, Alyssa Norwood, who represents Sustainable CT, another excellent nonprofit organization here in Connecticut. It has, among other things, developed a sustainability rating program for municipalities, promoting innovative practices that will lead to a cleaner and more equitable Connecticut. Alyssa serves as the program manager for certification and innovation, and in that role serves as the primary liaison for towns seeking to improve their sustainability across a range of dimensions, including affordable housing. She'll discuss additionally what Connecticut communities are doing and can do in this area. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew. And Matthew, I don't know if you want to introduce this video. I think I have it queued up on my screen. But I'm happy to have you introduce it as you see fit. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much to the organizers for putting together this panel. This is a very important topic to me personally and also to California YIMBY, and it's very heartening to see that we have parallel and collaborative partners around the country who are making the connection here between land use and sustainability. So I am going to start with a short video. The introduction is very brief. One of the things that California YIMBY is really striving to do is to make these relatively technical and complex and arcane topics much more accessible. And so we put a fair bit of effort into our education programs around helping our members. Sarah mentioned we're now up to 85,000 members around the state of California, help them understand the connection between these land use regulations and their lives. And I think that that's really an important task for all of us as advocates is helping people see the relevance to them. So I'm gonna let Sarah roll the video, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the more technical details that went into informing the video once it's done. So Sarah, please go ahead. Thanks.
California has a housing shortage and affordability crisis. Too many of our cities have made it illegal to build more homes, so people like Gabriella are forced to live far from their jobs and local services and spend hours every day stuck in traffic. All that driving and gridlock means we end up with more air pollution that makes people sick. In California, air pollution disproportionately impacts communities of color, and Wanda and her family are suffering because of it. In fact, cars and trucks are the largest source of climate pollution in California. That means that the climate crisis is getting worse because of the housing crisis. In addition to all the pollution, high housing costs push Californians to live in areas at high risk of dangerous wildfires. Because of climate change, these fires grow larger every year, putting more communities at risk and leaving Californians like Adrian without a place to live. The YIMBY movement is working to make it legal to build more multifamily homes in our cities. When we say yes to more homes near good jobs, transit, and walkable neighborhoods, we help Californians spend less time stuck in traffic and more time with their families while reducing the pollution that hurts both people and the planet. In order to solve the climate crisis, we have to solve the housing crisis by saying yes in my backyard to more homes.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to stop sharing so that we can focus on you. And I think Catherine has pinned you. So go ahead.
Oh, great. Well, thanks again, Sarah. And I would love folks' feedback on the video. One thing that we have heard that was on a humorous note is people were noting the irony of doing a video about climate change and ending with a barbecue. I assure you those were Impossible Burgers and Black Bean Burgers at the barbecue, because we're very aware of the connection between food and climate change as well. But tongue-in-cheek aside, so one of the things, as Sarah mentioned, California YIMBY focuses on state law in California to reform our land use regulations that have really made it very difficult and in many cases impossible to build multifamily housing in our cities. The stat that we rely on that is true across the state is about 75% of the urban land, so within the urban boundaries of the cities of California, is off limits to multifamily housing. They only allow single unit housing on that land. What that has done is led to a vast sprawl pattern of development that we're all familiar with. I'm not sure, I suspect that most of the folks joining us today are from Connecticut or from that area. if you're familiar with The Power Broker, the book about the life of Robert Moses, there's a lot of connection between what was going on, 100 years ago when Moses was building these new parkways and boulevards across New York and connecting distant suburbs to the city, and what California did just after the World War II era, when the era of highway building really took off. There were some decisions that were made about land use back then that we are now having to reckon with. And that was this notion that everyone could have a single unit house on a quarter acre, and that you could lead to a sort of a prosperous and sustainable society that way. What we're learning is that that's not actually possible. There's a whole bunch of data coming in that's been coming in, and frankly, the planners and some of the folks who warned about this 50, 75 years ago projected this outcome, that you'd reach a point where the distances were getting so far and the traffic getting so bad that you'd have serious problems you created for society as a result of that. And that's the air pollution that you've seen in the video, the climate impact. As of today, cars and trucks, so personal vehicles, are the largest source of carbon pollution, not just in California, but in the entire United States. And a lot of it is due to the sprawl pattern of development that we've embraced in the post-war era for the most part. Something that people lose track of, and people say, well, how are you going to change this? It seems really impossible, is to remember back through history. It wasn't that long ago that we started this. So in the early 1970s was the time when we actually reached the state when half of Americans actually owned their own car. So the notion that the United States was built for the automobile, that it's always been thus, that it's the only way we can live, is slightly ahistorical. That doesn't change the fact that the current land use pattern has made it a really difficult task. So there's no way we can just say, oh, we're going to ban cars or get rid of cars. Cars are here to stay. And I think that it's really important for us as land use advocates to recognize that a lot of folks depend on them. And it's frankly the majority of folks who use them to get around. What we're talking about is re-envisioning communities that have the ability to go car light or car free, to build infill housing in our central business districts, close to our central business districts. This doesn't just have to be in dense urban cities. And I think this is something that's really important to point out as a part of this conversation. There are plenty of examples of smaller villages that have commercial districts where you can add more infill housing and have the same result of creating more jobs in that area, of creating more opportunities to walk or take transit to a grocery station, to school, to healthcare, to daycare. And so this is really what we're focused on in California YIMBY, is the very first step in that very long equation, which is to making it legal to build that housing in the first place. Because as I mentioned, and it's not just in California, as you look around at our cities all over California and all over the United States, it is difficult, if not impossible, to build multifamily infill housing in our urban centers. And that includes small towns. So I live in Berkeley, California. The Bay Area is a vast metropolitan region of 7 million people, comprised of 49 cities. I live in Berkeley, California. There's only 120,000 people in Berkeley, California. And our central business district is medium sized. It's not huge, but we have the same challenge where most of the land around it was zoned for single family housing, was actually downzoned to single family housing in the 1970s and 80s. And so a lot of what we're focusing on is undoing those mistakes of what happened in the 70s and 80s of downzoning all these areas in our urban cores and returning them to allowing duplexes, fourplexes, 10-unit apartments, walk-ups, and the kinds of multifamily housing that really thrived in the post-war era up until the backlash. And there's books and books written about this. I encourage everyone to read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein if you're not familiar with it, but about why cities went through this trouble to reduce the amount of homes that could be built within their urban cores. It's an ugly history. It's not something that any city should be proud of. But thankfully, it's something that we can correct, and we have the tools. And as we build a bigger movement for reform, we'll make more progress. And I'm going to wrap up by saying I'm very pleased to say that this fall, California became the first state in the country to eliminate single unit zoning statewide. It is now legal to build at least a duplex on almost every property in the state. And in many of those cases, you can also split the property so that you can build 2 duplexes. It doesn't apply to every single property. We need to be careful about fire zones. As you saw in the video, we have a huge problem with fires. I know in areas where your part of the country, you've got sea level rise and storms that are getting worse. So climate change is real. We need to be planning for that as well. But one of the things that we're aware of is as the fires get worse and as the need to reduce pollution becomes more acute, that infill housing, and this is the thing I want to end on, infill housing is the #1 climate mitigation tool California has in its toolkit. There is a report I would refer everyone to by Chris Jones, who runs the Cool Climate Laboratory at University of California, Berkeley. He has maps of your area. So I encourage you to check out the Cool Climate maps that shows how much lower the carbon emissions are in an urban area versus in sprawl. And so what that means is as you add more housing in the urban area, you're actually reducing carbon pollution substantially, both from transportation and because multifamily housing uses half the energy of single unit housing. So all of these things point in the direction of making it legal to build more homes in our cities, of doing infill, smart infill development, which will also bring down costs and help the kind of workers you saw in the video live closer to where they work and spend less time in their car.
Thank you, Matthew, for that great video and great introduction. I think before I turn it over to Dave, just to comment, that map is the Cool Climate map you mentioned is a great resource. Thank you for pointing it out to our audience. And we've done some mapping with our zoning atlas, which is, for those who haven't seen it, online at desegregate.ct.org/atlas. And it shows exactly what you mentioned, which is that multifamily housing built as of right without onerous public hearing processes is only available in Connecticut in 2.1% of land in the state. So it was shocking when we compiled the results of the atlas, but that contrasted with the fact that 81% of residential land has large 1 acre, essentially single family housing lot size requirements. It's pretty dire, I guess you could say, in terms of the climate implications of our land use policies. With that, I'll turn it over to Dave Anderson from Save the Sound, who will bring us back down to Connecticut. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm going to share a brief PowerPoint presentation just to help me organize my thoughts, and hopefully everybody can see that. So I am new to Save the Sound. I just joined the organization back in July. And prior to that, I worked as a town planner here in Connecticut from 2008 to 2012. I worked in the town of East Haven. And then recently I left the town of Madison after serving for 9 years as their director of planning and economic development. So this is this topic is very near and dear to my heart. Save the Sound is where we work. We're on the shore of Connecticut and New York, as well as the North Fork of Long Island. And we're a multifaceted organization. We do pollution monitoring, take legal action when necessary, engage in legislative advocacy, and do ecological restoration projects. Today's focus will be on our lands preservation work, which is the primary capacity that I'm involved in. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a high-level overview of how zoning impacts land conservation, talk about the benefits of open space, the status of land conservation here in Connecticut. I'll argue that development is the biggest threat to land conservation and that we can ease development pressure through zoning reform, and ultimately that we need a multi-pronged approach to accomplish this. So the environmental benefits of open space are well known: wildlife habitat, water quality protection, manage stormwater by capturing precipitation, protect air quality, and carbon sequestration through photosynthesis, and carbon storage in the form of biomass. Proximity to parks and open space enhances the value of residential properties and produces increased tax revenue for communities. The Trust for Public Land conducted an economic analysis in Long Island revealing that the state's parks and open space provided $2.74 billion in annual economic benefit to local governments and taxpayers. And that conservation of Long Island's parks and open space is 8 times less costly than new residential development. Obviously, open space provides numerous health benefits, and sadly, nearly half of Americans get less than the recommended minimum amount of physical activity. And open space, and particularly proximity to open space, promote physical activity and improve mental health. I'd just like to note that Yukon Extension recently completed or launched a project called Connecticut Trail Finder, which is a free interactive mapping site to connect Connecticut residents and visitors to trails. And they're populating that website with more trails and more information on a daily basis. And they're also looking to link economic activity to trails, so highlighting which businesses are located in proximity to certain trail networks. So that's an exciting project I'd encourage you to check out. As far as our goals here in Connecticut for open space acquisition, we have the green plan. And that has a goal of conserving 21% of the state's land area as open space by 2023. And that's articulated in section 23-8 of Connecticut General Statutes. Currently, DEEP holds approximately 80% of their statutory share of this, and private partners hold approximately 75% of this share. There's more than 160,000 acres that still need to be preserved to meet this 21% goal. Nationally, we see an effort called 30 by 30, which is a goal to conserve at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. I'd argue that we should likely align Connecticut's green plan with this national goal, and that would require protection of an additional 288,000 acres, 448,000 in total by 2030. Currently, we're at approximately 53% of this target. So said another way, over the next 8 years, we would need to conserve nearly as much open space as we have throughout our entire history. So these are big targets and these are big challenges. So what's happening on the ground and how are we doing? Well, the Yukon Center for Land Use Education and Research performed a case study on the change in land cover over the 30-year period between 1985 and 2015 and found that Connecticut lost 47,000 acres of agricultural land and 134,000 acres of forest land during this time. So over that the past 25-year period, we're losing an average of 13.3 acres per day. That's every single day. And where is that loss coming from? And it's not surprising to anyone on this call that it's coming in the form of development. So we're losing forests and farmland to development. At the statewide level, the period from 1985 to 2015 saw the state's population grow by 12%, while development footprint grew by about 21%. So obviously this is not a sustainable future. Just to highlight some of the land preservation projects that Save the Sound has been involved in. First, I'll point to a success story, which is the preserve in Old Saybrook, Essex, and Westbrook. It's a 1,000-acre coastal forest. It was threatened by a development proposal of 220 homes and an 18-hole golf course, and it was protected in 2015 after a nearly 17-year battle by conservationists and local community members. So this was a huge win for the conservation community. But in the same time period, Connecticut lost 80,000 acres of forest land and farmland. Just a quick aerial image of the preserve. You can see how large of a property that is. A quick photo of the ribbon cutting ceremony, and then a map of the trail system of the preserve. And for folks in Connecticut, if you haven't got a chance to get out there to take a hike, I definitely recommend you do. It's a beautiful property. An example of an ongoing threat that we're dealing with is a property known as Oswalgotchi Hills. It's a 236-acre coastal forest abutting the Niantic River. It's threatened by a development proposal of 840 units, and it's currently in litigation after a 20-year battle. This is just an image of the property. And again, in red is the threatened property, and below in green is the Oswalgotchi Hills Nature Preserve, which again is a wonderful property to check out. And then new threats pop up every day. The Deer Lake Scout Reservation in Killingworth, Connecticut, 253 acres. It's got a mile-long lake, a contiguous forest land, and a wilderness camp, and it's recently threatened by development due to the proposed sale by the Boy Scouts of America. So some common themes that we deal with are these battles are lengthy, complicated, and costly. The cost of conservation is driven higher by the value of proposed development, and the pace of conservation is far slower than the pace of development and the resulting loss of open space. So what's happening here is, according to CLEAR, zeroing in on local maps of new development, new growth is dominated by sprawl as opposed to more compact patterns of growth. The fastest growing land cover during the study period is turf and grass category, which increased by 26% over the study period. And it now covers more of the state at 8% than agricultural fields. In order to reach our open space goals, we can't afford for this pattern to continue. Other impacts of sprawl style development prevents the potential for walkable neighborhoods, increasing reliance on vehicular travel and causing air pollution. And our car culture has also meant that we have a ton of paved surfaces, including parking lots, contributing to polluted stormwater runoff and increasing the heat island effect. So it boils down to a supply and demand problem. There is little we can do to control demand, but zoning directly regulates potential supply. Large minimum lot sizes of 1 acre or more constrains housing supply. not only increasing prices, but forcing development to expand into more forest land and farmland. To avoid sprawl and reduce development pressure on forest land, we need to increase supply by putting new housing where development already exists. Thankfully, the same strategies that help increase housing affordability and diversity also help avoid sprawl and reduce development pressure on forest land and farmland. We can reduce minimum lot sizes. We can establish open space conservation districts and cluster developments as opposed to standard subdivisions. We can build accessory apartments, middle housing of 2 to 4 units, multifamily and mixed use development, and transit-oriented communities. So again, the same strategies apply to help land conservation as they do for affordability and housing diversity. In addition to those zoning changes, we also need to make efforts for additional natural resource protections for core forests. We need more funding for land conservation. These are costly endeavors and they take a lot of time. And I'd argue we need to incentivize landowners a little bit more to conserve underdeveloped property by strengthening the Public Act 490 program. And as individuals, we need to engage with open spaces, go for a hike, go for a walk, go bird watching, and then communicate to our elected officials and legislators about their importance and encourage them to take the necessary actions. And then finally, and somewhat shamelessly, I'll say you need to support local land conservation organizations like Save the Sound, but definitely your local land trust, Connecticut Land Conservation Council, and the others I've listed here. I think that goes a long way towards helping these organizations do what they do best. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. And I think you're introducing us to how what Matthew was talking about really applies to Connecticut. Was really powerful and important. And just to repeat something that you said before turning to Alyssa, the same strategies that make sense for housing really make sense for our environment. And I remember when you guys were fighting the preserve, fighting for the preserve, and that was really about, again, the threat of large lot sprawl and residential development. Now we have this great land that was protected as a result of your efforts. So thank you. With that, we will turn to our final speaker, Alyssa Norwood from Sustainable CT. And again, I don't know if you're sharing slides, but I'm just going to let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks for the really thoughtful ordering of speakers, because thanks to Matthew and David, a lot of my work has been done for me. And I also really appreciate thematically this movement of looking at things from a California and a national perspective and these shared struggles in communities across the United States, moving to Connecticut. And Sustainable CT, our tagline is local action, statewide impact, and is really the embodiment of local zoning driving this really broad ripple effect and a recognition of our interconnectedness. So I'm actually not going to share slides because I feel like a lot of them have been duplicative of other speakers. So I'm going to use my time to hopefully catapult us into some really meaningful conversation and share in listening to the speakers that preceded me some reflections, and hopefully we can have some robust conversation around boots on the ground work. So a couple of different thoughts. One, I have a public health background, and I'm reminded of the origins of zoning, which we think of as having been an institution that's been around forever, and yet it's only really been there are probably some historians that know this data better than I do, but it's been really about 100 years, let's say, that we've had meaningful zoning, and a lot shorter of a time in other places, and grounded in this idea that industrial polluting spaces should be separate from residential zones. And how ironic it is that we've zoned ourselves back in many places in the United States to a state of unhealthiness because they were rooted in a time and place and technological context different from the one that we have now. And as I reflect and we tie all of this back to the idea of climate, nature is our best teacher. I once had I'm a lover of yoga, and I have a yoga teacher who once said the body never lies. And it's really true. And if we think of our bodies and ourselves as an extension of nature and climate never lies. And the reason I think about this is the speed at which nature moves and the speed at which things evolved in the natural world, which we're very much a part of. We forget that, and how that's situated in terms of the context and the pace of our lives. So, why do I bring this up when I think about, and you all could reflect maybe in a pre-COVID world more than a post-COVID, depending on people's work situations, at how many moments in my day have I amplified myself through extension of technology, whether getting in a car to move faster, using a technology to type faster, to think faster. So one of the purposes of zoning in my mind, and we probably have political theorists that could talk a lot about the role of government, but we all have these human tendencies, and one societally as a whole is this idea of moving faster, farther, and zoning is this incredible tool to bring us back into alignment with who and what we are, to change our speed and to remember what it is to exist in our environment, whether it's the natural environment or the built environment, and increasingly in tandem with conservation is this idea that those two ideas need to intermingle, that we need to conserve natural and wild places, but that simultaneously we also need to hold the ability to have our built environment and our built landscape seamlessly interwoven and interconnect with the natural world, whether it's through Matthew and David spoke about the importance of tree equity and natural spaces and walkability. And these are all ideas, as I look at the list of folks here, that you're all well familiar with, so I don't need to reinforce what's really been said, but to just be grounded in this reality that zoning and climate change, that there needs to be this marriage of understanding that we need to recalibrate our speed and that we need to use zoning to slow down and remember what it is to move through the world and move through community as the beings that we are, beings that walk, that like to interact socially, and so on. There are a lot of different specific zoning lenses that I could look at, and I see many friends on this list. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Sustainable CT is a voluntary certification program for towns. We have a roadmap of actions in 13 different categories where municipalities can take action and collectively earn a sustainability certification for that work. Zoning is a huge component of our program and actions that different municipalities can take. Among our 13 categories, again, just to focus in one place, we have a category on housing. And again, to reinforce some of the themes that David and Matthew said, there's so much great work to be done in terms of promoting sustainability through thinking about housing. So Matthew already spoke about infill. I want to speak about just one action in our program, and it's around promoting sustainable zoning. It has several different components. Many folks who I see that are here have taken some of these steps, but among them, establishing an incentive housing zone is a way to promote a lot of these ideas around density, affordability, connection to transit, and so on. The most sustainable house, of course, is the one that's already been built. We have a plethora of single family housing in Connecticut. 70% of Connecticut's housing stock is probably what you think of classically, single family, bedrooms on the second floor. Not at this moment in time, if we were thinking about our state and our demographics and we were building from scratch what we design. So there's a lot of great work to be done thinking about and supplementing with other housing types and using infill is a development model. But if we start from this premise of, again, the house that exists is the most sustainable, it's helpful to remember that is required by the Fair Housing Act that unrelated people have to be allowed to live in a single family household, of course, with attention to your municipality's maximum occupancy limits. But there's this forgetfulness around that and a lot of restriction around letting people come together. And there are many successful models around the United States of people that engage in co-housing arrangements, unrelated individuals living in the same house. So flexibility, enhanced understanding in order to use the housing supply that we already have is helpful. And I'll just close by thanking my colleagues who presented already and looking forward to continued conversation. And thanks, Sarah, for having us.
Yeah, thank you. And what a great way to tie everything together, Alyssa. I'm seeing some questions from the audience, and feel free to direct message me or put it in the chat, and I'm happy to move them to the floor for the panels. Matthew, you mentioned in one of the chats that you just posted that Berkeley was one of the first cities in the country to establish single family zoning. back in, I think, 1916. So how, I mean, with that history in mind, and Alyssa just reminded us about that too, how hard is it, as in your role as a communications director, to change people's minds about the length of time that zoning has been in effect, and sort of the status quo and the bias towards the status quo that we see in study after study psychologically? What we've seen in Connecticut is something very similar, which is people think, well, this is how it always was. Well, Connecticut is a state that's, you know, I've been one of the earliest states, and zoning hasn't been around all that long. It's just been pointed out. So I'd love for you to speak about how you change the status quo, how you change people's minds. Have you found the video to be very effective? What are the other tools that you use to make those changes?
It's a great question, Sarah. And there's an entire cottage industry that I'm sort of on the edge of around this notion of actual mind changing. I'm going to offer a reframe. What we found in California is most people are already there. And the reason is that they can see in their day-to-day lives that there's a serious problem. You have parents whose kids are saying, I'll never move home again because I can't afford it. You have seniors who are being priced out of their communities, who are renters. They don't have anywhere to go. You have 160,000 people experiencing homelessness in the streets of California. You have people who are being offered jobs paying $150,000 a year in California and saying, that's not enough. I can't afford a house on that salary. So all these things kind of converge to polling that I've done and polling that others have done across the state that show between 65 and 75% of Californians will tell you unequivocally they want to see more homes built in their neighborhood. They want to see more homes built near jobs, near transit. They would love to spend less than 3 to 4 hours a day in their car. These things are all related, and people kind of get it. They know that their job is an hour away and they have to drive there, and so they've got this hellish commute every day. And that's especially so for the people we call the frontline workers coming out of COVID, the nurses, the teachers, the firefighters, the police officers, the folks who used to be considered middle income and could afford a home on a middle income. You can't come anywhere near a coastal California community on a middle income right now. The median cost of a home in coastal California is approaching $1 million. So everyone can sort of see and experience in their own lives, this isn't working for me. And when you've got the middle class saying this isn't working for us anymore, you've got a real potential movement. I think that that what we're really battling is entrenched power, and it's not that that homeowners as a class are the problem, because there's plenty of homeowners. I've organized homeowners. I'm a homeowner in South Berkeley, and I've organized a group in my part of the city, excuse me, to advocate for zoning reform in the city. Berkeley is going to do away with single family zoning. We're going to do fourplexes by right citywide, hopefully by the end of the year. But it took organizing folks in the neighborhood, and I know there's a lot of organizers on the call. It is not nearly as hard as you think it is. What we found is that there are a lot of folks, as I mentioned, who already are seeing the problems, they're experiencing the problems, and they just need a spark. And what that spark was in my case was a few of us who met at a planning commission meeting where housing people tend to often meet each other. And we said, hey, what are we going to do about this? And what we found was there was a huge amount of pent-up demand for reform. And so part of what's happening now is you know, I think Sarah introduced this session, you know, it's heartening to see that there really is a national movement. And I have to say, I've been an activist for 20 years. I've mostly worked in climate policy and energy related topics. I've never seen a movement grow as quickly and as organically as the movement for reform around housing, and something that didn't come up in the speaker's things. And I do want to put one big plug in: transportation, because housing and transportation are the same thing. You really can't describe them as separate issues. And so what we're finding is that there's a convergence happening where you have, I noticed on the call, there were some bicycle people. Hello, I'm a bicycle person, but I'm also a bus and a train person. We're converging around this question of land use. And as you sort of bring folks together and put them in a room and have them talk about what is it they would like to see, what is it that's frustrating, what is it that isn't working, it all comes back to this same question. Where are we allowing people to live? Where are we forcing people to live? Would they like to live there, or would they prefer to live somewhere closer to where they need to be every day? And almost without exception, people are saying, I would really like to live closer to where I need to be every day. So you start to get at this core, the sort of kernel of the challenge without even having to do too much like in your face education. It's sort of like expressing to someone, we know that this is your lived experience. Is that what you really want? And if we could offer you something that gave you more of what you were looking for, would you support that? And the answer is unequivocally yes. There was some research done a few years ago out of the University of Wisconsin that asked Americans, if you could live somewhere where you could walk for most of your daily errands, how much more would you be willing to pay for that? And everyone said, I would pay 10 to 20% more than I'm paying now if I could walk everywhere. That includes some folks who might not even, like in theory, be able to afford using the traditional equation of what a house is supposed to cost, what transportation is supposed to cost. But what's lost in a lot of this is how much Americans spend every year driving to where they need to go. It's one of the single largest expenses that Americans have. People are often shocked. It's $1.5 trillion per year that Americans spend on cars. So when we talk about the need to, I think Alyssa mentioned, we need to slow down. The only thing I'll put an asterisk on, Alyssa, to that was we actually used to have good transit in this country. In addition to having denser development patterns, we also had pretty good transit, and we tore it up and destroyed it to make room for the cars. I am a part of the movement, and I hope that others will join me in the movement. I think it's time to flip the switch and to start tearing out the infrastructure we built for cars, which, by the way, we can't afford. It's never paid for itself, and putting back rapid transit that will actually enable people to get to where they're going efficiently, sustainably, and help us solve some of our other land use issues. I think that the biggest challenge, I'll wrap up. I think the biggest challenge we face, frankly, is the built environment is obviously literally concrete. And it's very hard to tear up concrete, not just politically, but even physically. The cost is very expensive. We've got to start looking for opportunities to tear up concrete strategically. There are places that are doing this. It is not a pipe dream to tear down freeways. It is happening. I think that all of us need to start looking for which is going to be the first freeway in our city that we tear down and replace it with housing, with parks, with accessible schools, with groceries, with daycare, because that's the future. And as soon as we can get that going, I think we'll start to see a groundswell support. This is what everybody wants.
Yeah. So those are great points. And I just dropped in the chat, I just finished a book chapter. It's kind of summarizing transportation and land use policy and the nexus between those. And it just has a slew of sources and stats. So if anybody's interested in that topic and would want to read a more scholarly write-up of it, feel free to download that. It's a free download. I do want to mention that we do have several members of our coalition, both on the call and off, who deal with transportation. So you've been seeing Tony Chirola's post in the chat from Transport Hartford and Center for Latino Progress. And Gadwa is on the call from Sierra Club. We have Park New Haven, which is a parking authority actually that has joined our coalition, again, in recognition that these problems are very real in Connecticut. I did want to turn, and certainly many people agree with what you're saying, and New Haven has actually made progress in tearing up one of its highways. I do want to get to one of the questions from the chat, which is that I just lost it. And I think this is for Dave, really. Beyond the carrot approach of encouraging transit-oriented and infill development, should we also be considering fees or bans in Connecticut on open space sprawl development and farmland subdivision? So in other words, we've tried to start thinking about, well, incentive programs. Is it really time to be more aggressive on some of the biggest encroachments on farmland and open space, in your opinion?
No, I think, which is exactly why I said a multi-pronged approach is necessary. I mentioned that natural resource protection for core forests. I personally think we need to start treating core forests like we do wetlands. And currently we're not doing that. You could develop a core forest and there's no repercussions of that activity. I think in the future we'll look back on that as a big mistake. So I think similarly we could probably come up with some legislative protections for agricultural land. So I absolutely agree with that. I don't think the carrot approach alone is going to solve this problem.
Great. And I'd love to turn the question over to Alyssa as well. Are you seeing local governments address these open space farmland preservation? We have a couple of questions in the chat about farmland preservation and other threats to open space. Are you seeing local governments try to address those issues on their own through your program and through your rating efforts?
Yeah, and Sarah, if you don't mind, I said there's a lot of great conversation in the chat, so I might try to weave a couple of different things together. I also see conversations about animal agriculture and land use generally, and this is something we talk a lot about sustainable CT, even within the same context, all of us aligned and marching in the same direction and saying, we value the planet and we value the climate, and we all are coalesced around this goal of safeguarding land and using it for its best purpose. Part of the lens of our program, again, the reason that there's this really strong local bias is what works well in one place isn't necessarily the right thing in a different context. So this idea of land conservation versus smart growth versus solar farms versus responsible agriculture, there are many different ways to develop a parcel, and part of the way sustainable CT is constructed is this idea of honoring choice and best practices. So I guess the question is are localities addressing this on their own? And I think the answer isn't just yes, but there's really no other choice, because we can sit here as talking heads and experts about best practices all day long, but in the end, and Sarah, you know this from having been with us from the beginning of our program, so much of sustainable CT is about honoring the journey of equity in a given context and in a given community, and broadly defined both human animals and non-human animals and life holistically. So not that these are easy conversations to have, there's a lot of nuance and time consuming and real and difficult work in the engagement necessary to think about land use. So, I know I'm probably going pretty far astray of the question, but, I want to use the space as a platform to drive home the point that, policy is meaningless if it's not grounded in the will of the community and in conversation, and not to say that there aren't voices that might be counter to best practices and best policy, but to create a container for robust dialogue and conversation, so that whatever movement forward there is, whether it's preserving a forest or redeveloping a brownfield, that it's done so in a way that aligns with particularly the most disempowered voices in a community.
Matthew, how has that played out in California, the discussions of equity? How do your members view that question? Do they see it as interlinked? And how did you get, SB 9 and SB 10, two laws that Governor Newsom just signed recently? How did that question of equity come into play in the passage of that legislation?
So California is a plurality state. We have no majority ethnic or racial group anymore. And so equity is, you don't have any conversation about policy in the state without centering equity really as a part of the conversation. Just as a sort of, as a framework for how we talk about these things. The real challenge we have around specific issues of affordability and equity, and in particular, the historic injustices that were done to Black and Brown and Indigenous communities in California, is around coming up with both a mixture of funding, and the funding, I can't overstate enough how important the funding sources are, because we need a lot of subsidized housing. As in hundreds of thousands, if not a million units of subsidized housing in order to sort of close the gap between what people are earning and what people can afford. And so because that's on the order of potentially $1 trillion, it's many hundreds of billions of dollars. It's a long-term conversation. One of the things that is starting to take off again, and I would encourage other folks to take a look at, is social housing. It has a bad history with urban renewal, and nobody wants to go back through that process again. But there are other and better ways to do public or social housing. And I think that now that there's much more attention focused on the issue, it's got potential that it wouldn't have had even just 10 or 15 years ago. So, there's a lot that has to be done to make sure that the housing is accessible and affordable to people who are making a middle income wage, and in particular, lower income and no income folks who are being priced out of the market completely. And a lot of those folks are the ones who are being priced into homelessness. I think that there's some myth busting we need to do as advocates around the causes of being unhoused. It is mostly people who've been priced out of their homes. There's tons of research on this that shows that most of the folks experiencing homelessness are homeless in the neighborhoods where they used to have a house. So this is not a mental health issue. It is not a drug issue. It is people who can't afford where they live. So we all have an obligation to help our neighbors understand that. But as far as getting I want to answer your question about SB 9 and 10. Policy is a very, very long arc. And part of the challenge that we've had in California in the buildup to doing a new social housing authority, which was, we basically completely undid our social housing program about a decade ago. Got rid of all the funding and all the agencies that did that. But you've got to build back up to it through a series of policies that sort of point the way to that. We at California Unity, when we first got started, picked off a very big, hairy, audacious goal of rezoning the entire state to basically make a middle level density. So buildings up from 8 to 12 stories legal by right in all downtown areas. Very popular with a very small group of planners and housing advocates like me. But it also was a bit of a political bomb because people just weren't ready to have that conversation. That piece of legislation, which was called SB 50, included pretty aggressive affordability targets that would have helped address a lot of equity issues at the moment. So if we had made those buildings legal at the time, you would have had to include a certain amount of affordable units in them, subsidized either through state subsidies or housing vouchers or all the various ways that you can subsidize housing. The bill didn't make it through. But what it did do is it kicked off this conversation about the fact that we're not going to make our affordability goals if we don't go through this gate of making it legal to build the homes in the first place. So what SB 9 and 10 are doing is really targeting where most people live, which is in middle income housing. So one thing that gets lost in a lot of the conversation is even people who make good money, who can't afford a house, they're never going to qualify for a housing subsidy. And this is really important because you don't want everyone to live in subsidized housing because now you're talking about more money than the government will ever have. So you really do need to beef up that's what we call the missing middle of housing. And thankfully, because of several years of really good advocacy and education and frankly, more policymakers getting into office who have a pretty deep understanding of this problem. This is the biggest problem in California. You're seeing much more understanding of the nuance around, well, SB 9 and 10 don't have any specific affordability requirements, but let's remember, 90% of Californians live in market rate housing. And we used to build enough of it that our middle income folks could afford to find a house without needing a subsidy. What they don't want to do is create a massive new program that requires a constant stream of subsidies in a state that has a very uneven budget year after year. So what SB 9 and 10 did and are going to hopefully prove is that you need the market to provide housing for middle income workers because you'll never have enough money to provide for all the lower income folks and solve the equity problems. But you also need to prove that you can break this logjam around single unit exclusionary zoning in your cities. You've got to show that you can take on the cities and win and make them realize that you've got to start doing more multifamily housing. So we're very much engaged. We were very proud as a sponsor of SB 10 and a big supporter of SB 9 to get those through and to end single unit zoning in California. But that doesn't drop our bigger goal, which is getting a social housing authority launched, getting the bonding authority in place so that the money is there to pay for those homes, getting more subsidies for inclusionary housing or subsidized housing, depending on how it gets built. There's no way to get around the fact that you're going to have to find the tax revenues to solve those problems. And then there's one final thing I want to end on, and I know it's very interesting because I came from conservation, so I learned about these things through housing. My background's in environmental policy and energy and air quality law. We have got to look at wage equity. You have to raise the wages of people earning at the bottom end, because the fact is we've got ourselves behind such an 8-ball in the shortage of housing supply in our cities that even if we just completely unleashed market forces and let as much housing be built as possible, they still wouldn't be able to afford to live there. They're going to need higher wages and we're going to need to subsidize their housing. And we've got to do both. And I think the wage equity question, take away the issues around housing and all the other problems that low wages cause. It is the core equity question, is giving people more money for their work. And if there's one thing we're learning right now coming out of the pandemic, We had a lot of folks who were called frontline workers. We're not paying them like they're frontline workers. And I just have to put in a plug for wage equity as a part of this. People deserve to earn more money for the jobs they're doing. And one thing they're saying right now is they're not going to go back to work if they're being at risk and they're not being paid enough. It's very much tied into this conversation about equity in housing, because you've got to come at it from both ends. So yes, subsidize their homes. Yes, legalize them, upzone, make denser housing near our jobs and in those areas where people can access healthcare and schools, but also pay them more money, because that will also reduce the amount of subsidy you have to give them. So.
All right, thank you, Matthew. There was another question in the chat about conservation commissions and education for those. So shifting gears just a little bit, I wanted to turn back to Dave and ask, to what extent does Save the Sound or other environmental groups engage in land use commissioner training? I think not so much right now, but do you see an opportunity with the bill that just passed requiring land use commissioners to get training to kind of help them understand the way that all of these issues, equity, environment, economy, are interlinked in the kinds of zoning regulations that they approve and the kinds of decisions that they make?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we work closely with the Connecticut Land Conservation Council, and I'm actually attending a walk with my local land trust, the Madison Land Conservation Trust, in just a couple of weeks, and start invigorating some of those conversations. We do have. I had an issue as town planner in Madison where I basically worked to facilitate what was considered a higher density development proposal of 4 units an acre, where it was 1 unit an acre, which was just 1/4 mile from our town center. And the folks that lived there appreciated walkable communities, but they appreciated the exclusive right to their walkable community and didn't really want to share it with others. And they used some environmental arguments against the project, which I found might have been a little bit disingenuous. And so I do think that conversation needs to take place, and kind of a little bit more of a balanced perspective on environmental impacts that are very site specific, and kind of the bigger global issue needs to be talked about more. And so I think even among environmental professionals and environmental lawyers, I think maybe we need to be a little bit more conscious of that balance, because personally, is coming from a position of planning and economic development, everything is a balance and there's competing forces happening at all times. So kind of backing up what Matthew said, there's no one quiver solution. You have to undertake a lot of different strategies, and certainly your suggestion of just getting planning and zoning commissions and conservation commissions and economic development professionals all in a room to have a discussion, I think is valuable. And, I think in some ways that's a little bit what these webinars are doing, I think, is just getting people to start thinking and talking about these bigger picture issues. And then, when it comes down to site specific issues that are very tense and emotional locally, you have a little backdrop of a conversation that can help get through some of those more difficult conversations. So.
Great, thank you for that. We did just get a question about whether Connecticut just passed a law that planning and zoning commissioners be trained. It's in there. You can actually just dropped a link in the website to the website. It's a few hours every couple of years, which is a starting point. Not everything that we had hoped for, but Connecticut never had land use training for commissioners, and so it's now in the bill, now in state law. Alyssa, I just wanted to know if you had any closing comments before I wrap, to see preview the couple of events that we have upcoming.
I guess the final thought would be this idea of balance, and with humility. We each see the world through our lens, whether it's brownfield redevelopment or open space preservation or smart growth, and the sustainable CT organizationally has this really broad and holistic view of what sustainability is, encompassing all that it is to be human and to be whole, and what it is to be connected, what it is to need to have a thriving economy, what it is to honor equity. So as we think and do this work to make sure that all of us, especially all of us, approach this work with beginner's mind, because there's this deep and easy trap of knowing too much and thinking that we have all the answers, and just all of us remembering and honoring this journey of deep listening always, but especially the more we know, the more we have to unknow. So I'll close with that.
Thank you, Alyssa. I really appreciate that. And that's what we try to do. What we're going to continue to try to do through the fall is really listen to lots of different voices as we develop our legislative agenda. Again, very likely to focus on the issues that we talked about today. But one of the ways that we can hear from a broad cross-section of community members is through a new set of videos that's going to be launched at the end of this month. So upcoming I guess it's just in a week and a half, maybe, video launch party where we will be hearing from people who have told us their stories from around the state, and we'll be watching videos that relate to their perspectives. And we're also going to hear about parking. So we talked a lot about transportation today. So following the video launch party, we will have an opt-in to parking reform event. As of October 1st, you may know, parking minimums are now in effect. Caps on minimum parking mandates are in effect in Connecticut. So Matthew would love to give you more info about that, because we're very excited about that here. And we hope communities continue to opt in to that and do even more. So we have a great panel with that, co-sponsored by Center for Latino Progress and Park Haven. So with that, I will just point you back to our events page of our website. Thank you for being here. Thank all of our excellent panelists, and really excited that this will kick off our fall conversation. This will be recorded and posted to our website for your future use. Thank you again.